Let's take a moment to talk about web layout. This is something you're going to need for the team project. Obviously, when you create your team project site, you want it to be as attractive as possible. You want it to use good design principles, and you want it to be accessible. What I'm going to show you in this and another presentation regarding web layout will give you some ideas about how you can arrange your pages so that they are more modern and more accessible. There are many ways in which you can organize web pages. One that we're going to focus on, and that is covered in the textbook as well, is the box model. In terms of arranging the content on your page, you can treat each element in a page as a rectangular box. Now, this is helpful for arranging these boxes in the order in which you wish to see them. Some key concepts, though, that we need to understand in order to be able to use the box model is the idea of padding, which is space between the content and any border. The border itself, which is between the padding and the margin, which is the empty space between the element and any adjacent elements. Take a moment to examine this graphic and make sure you understand these three concepts before moving forward. In terms of CSS, when we use the box model, we have equivalent properties for the items we mentioned just a moment ago. Margin, padding, and border all have CSS equivalents. For margin, you actually have four related properties: margin top, margin left, margin bottom, and margin right, allowing you to set them individually. You have a similar situation with padding, where you have four different settings, and you have border, which many of you have already used to set, for example, borders around specific headlines, where you can set colors, whether the line is solid, and the width of the border. There's a link here to a web page. I encourage you to check it out to get an example of using some of these properties. When it comes to the box model, the div element becomes very, very important. As you go to this web page, be sure and view the source so you can see what's going on and see how the div element is used. There's something in CSS called float, which might come in handy when you go to arrange the content on your page. Normally, when you add HTML elements in your code, they're simply displayed in the order in which they appear. In other words, the order in which they appear in the source code. Through CSS, we can use the float property, which allows you to be more specific about where a certain element will appear within its what we call container. An example of an inline style which uses float is shown here. Now here float is set to right, but you can vary that value from right to left, etc., to make it appear on the screen in the location you want it to appear. You can also add margins and things like that. Take a look at the web page that is linked in the title here and get an example of how float is used. Again, view the source, check out what's going on, and take note of how the div element is used. Now, another option for layout would be a two-column layout. Here, all you really need to do is configure one of your columns, quote unquote, to float. Now, you see a graphic here with a single column wireframe and a two-column wireframe. This uses some of the HTML sections that we really haven't focused on, like header, nav, main, and footer, which are relatively new, but you can certainly use them. The important thing to remember here is that if you decide to do a two-column layout, you configure one of those columns to float, as we mentioned, but remember to code the element to float before the others. Again, check out the web page linked on this page. Type in the URL to your browser, check out the visual that comes up, as well as checking out the source code, taking note of the div elements and how they're used, as well as the style. Many of you have already played around with making custom hyperlinks. Through some of the assignments, you were able to remove the underlining from links, for example. And many of you found that the text decoration property can be used to specify none, which means remove the underlining. Now, one other thing that you may or may not have played with, wasn't a specific part of any assignment, is the idea of pseudoclasses in CSS. These allow you to get a little more specific about how, for example, a hyperlink will work in different situations. For example, you can change the color of a hyperlink when it has not been visited. You can change things like the color and the underlining of a hyperlink when you move your mouse over it. The example shown here demonstrates that. Now, there are two web pages linked on this particular slide. Feel free to type in the URLs for each into your browser. Check out the source, see what's going on. They're examples of these concepts. Finally, just to reiterate something that's in the textbook about display rules. There is a display property, and some of you have already seen this and perhaps used it. But the display property can be useful. Here we have a few different values you can have for display. None can be used to hide an element. Block allows you to treat an element as what we call a block element. Inline allows you to treat an element as what we call an inline element. And this is all related to how the item is ultimately displayed. There's also an inline block setting. This allows the element to display as an inline display element adjacent to the other inline display elements. But it can also have some of its properties configured, kind of like block elements. The web page you see linked here should be checked out. Type in the URL to your browser, check out what's there, check out the source code. Make sure you understand what it's doing, especially with the display property. This is the end of our presentation. Next time we'll take a look at more web layout ideas.